Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's April 27th, 2024. I'm Jeff. Joining me is Ness. In this episode, we'll be discussing the campus protests in America. But first, I want to briefly touch on Christian Zionism and how I think it's tying into the Israel-Hamas war as well as these protests. So, Christian Zionism. It is a religious and political belief system that combines elements of Christianity and Zionism. It is rooted in the belief that the establishment of the State of Israel and the gathering of Jewish people in the Holy Land are fulfillment of biblical prophecy, particularly in relation to end times theology. Christian Zionists typically believe that the return of Jews to Israel and the restoration of the Jewish state are necessary precursors to the second coming of Jesus Christ. They often interpret various biblical passages, particularly those from the Old Testament, as predicting the restoration of Israel and the ingathering of the Jewish people. There were a few things that made me think of Christian Zionism this week. First, when Mike Johnson finally was able to accomplish his top priority, the first thing he mentioned when he became speaker, which was making sure that Israel gets what it needs. He was finally able to push through the $98 billion military aid bill. So when he was talking about how proud he was of passing that, he said, quote, "It's a biblical admonition to support Israel." And then shortly before that, during another congressional hearing on the scourge of anti-Semitism, the president of Columbia University, who is a Egyptian Muslim, was dragged before Congress and lectured about how she and her university are not doing enough to address anti-Semitism. One of the speakers, or one of the Congress people, was Rick Allen, and I'm going to play a clip of him.
Are you familiar with Genesis 12:3? Well, it's pretty clear. It was the covenant that God made with Abraham. And that covenant was real clear. If you bless Israel, I will bless you. If you curse Israel, I will curse you. And then in the New Testament, it was confirmed that all nations would be blessed through you. So you do not know about that. Do you consider that a serious issue? I mean, do you want Columbia University to be cursed by God of the Bible?
Definitely not.
Okay. Well, that's good. So here's the deal. In fact, I tell my colleagues that Washington, D.C. is not the center of the universe. Jerusalem is the center of the universe. We got freedom of speech in this country and freedom of religion. Yet we also have Moses looking down on the entire body of Congress who gave us the law, which most of our laws were made and are supposed to be enforced, came from the original law. Maybe you should have a course, and you don't have to believe it, but the Bible is an incredible book. There's a lot of history there, and you don't have to believe it, but you need to know what's in there. Maybe you should have a course suggested for those who are having problems with all of this on the Bible and what's in the Bible and kind of what will happen if, under the wrath of God. I mean, we have above the American flag in our chamber, "In God We Trust." I mean, what God is that? Do you understand why we're here? This is a serious issue. What do you know about this issue, and how do you feel about it? I mean, what are your feelings on what young people are being indoctrinated by these professors to believe this stuff, and they have no idea that they're going to be cursed by God, the God of the Bible, and the God over our flag. What are your thoughts?
We have to be able to have rules that make sense. We have to be able to enforce them because people learn from consequences. We have to have order. And then we need deep anti-Semitism training, as we heard the Congresswoman talk. This is essential. We must train people on what this is. And finally,
I'm just about out of time, but you need to know
education.
That also, education is important, knowledge is important, but the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God.
Rick Allen represents a district in eastern Georgia, So I don't know if he believes everything he's saying or if he's playing to what he thinks his constituents want to hear, or maybe a little bit of both. The Bible verse he was referring to is Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And this verse is often interpreted as a promise to Abraham and his descendants, being the Jewish people, and some see this as implying support for Israel. And there's a bunch of other verses we could go through. I'll just go through one more in the Old Testament, Ezekiel 37:21 through 22. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. So in trying to figure out why there's this obsession with Israel and this literal willingness of the Speaker of the House to put the interest of Israel above the United States, I think Christian Zionism is at least part of the reason. This philo-Semitism is quite a contrast from Christianity's historical antipathy towards Jews. Matthew 27:25, during the trial of Jesus, the crowd famously says, "His blood be on us and on our children." And Martin Luther, writing on the Jews and their lies, expressing hostile, vitriolic views towards Jews, accusing them of blasphemy, rejected their religious beliefs, advocated for harsh measures against them, including expulsion from Christian lands, presumably that would include Israel, and destruction of their synagogues and homes. And even in the more recent times, in 1972, Billy Graham was speaking with Richard Nixon, and there were these recorded conversations that didn't come out till decades later. But among other things, Graham expressed concern about what he perceived as Jewish domination of the media, stating, quote, "The stranglehold has got to be broken, or the country's going down the drain." He made comments about Jewish influence in Hollywood and the media, suggesting that Jews were responsible for producing, quote, "all the dirty movies," and had a disproportionate impact on culture. He commented on Jewish ownership of newspapers, expressing the belief that a lot of Jews are great friends of mine. They swarm around me and are friendly to me because they know that I am friendly with Israel, but they don't know how I really feel about what they're doing to this country. So I'm trying to understand all of this, put it in perspective, and understand how it affects what's going on today in Israel, because I believe Ness will back this up with polling data, but certainly among the strongest supporters in America, the core demographic that enables this support are evangelical Christians. And the question is, why are they so steadfastly in support of Israel? And how recent is this phenomenon? We've seen that up until relatively recently, Christians were hostile towards Jews. And so what accounts for this switch?
Dispensationalism is a 19th century invention. You rightly point out that for 1800 years of Christianity's existence, it was explicitly hostile to Jews and Judaism, to the extent that crusades in the 11th and 12th century had to be put back on track multiple times because the population would divert itself and engage in pogroms against Jewish populations that were living in Europe that were never really integrated fully into society, into European society. But today I think also it's worth pointing out that the imperative support for Israel doesn't come from evangelicals who have no support at all. They're just useful idiots. The support comes from the billionaire class that is overwhelmingly Jewish. That's where the support comes from. It is the way it manifests itself on the right side of the aisle is through religious affinity towards the Holy Land and towards Israel, but that is not the driving force. If the power centers don't want something and evangelicals do, there's a 0% chance evangelicals will get what they want. And I defy anyone to challenge me on that and come up with a counterexample where evangelicals are in support of something, but the very secular leftist power structure is opposed to it and the evangelicals get their way.
Overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, I have to think about that somewhat. I think it's actually redounding to the Power Center's benefit that Roe v. Wade has been overturned. But that wasn't because of evangelical support. That was because of the Supreme Court.
Which I would argue that Trump was one of his biggest pitches to getting evangelical support was his promise to appoint conservative justices that would ultimately overturn Roe v. Wade. And I think he had to emphasize that so much because of his other very questionable moral, personal conduct. He said, well, you might not like that I've had 3 wives and I have affairs with porn stars, but if you elect me, I'm going to put justices on the Supreme Court and we'll finally overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, I don't think that's distinguishable from any other Republican presidential candidate. All of George Bush's appointees also voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? In the bill that you're referencing here, that $95 billion was spent for, more money was given to Ukraine than to Israel, and there's very little evangelical support for Ukraine. So I think that just underscores clearly my point that it doesn't matter what evangelicals, what they think. I mean, of course the power centers will always take support that's given to them, but they're not a determinative factor in any way. And the fact that they strongly opposed more funding for Ukraine didn't stop Ukraine funding. A Pew Research survey conducted in 2020 before October 7th and the current round of hostilities broke out asked American Jews about Israel and their attachment to it, their sentiments, their affinity for the state. And some 82% of those surveyed said that caring about Israel is either essential or an important part of what being Jewish means to them. And just 16% said it was not important. So to underscore I think the primary driver of support for Israel in the U.S. is Jewish in nature, and the evangelical support is a second tier to that, numerically larger, but in terms of influence and power and status, far less important. Rick Allen, congressman, you pulled the clip up, Jeff, is kind of a perfect example of that. So outside of his rural, poor district in eastern Georgia, that's like the quintessential example of someone who has no power, no influence. He was literally being laughed at during the course of that congressional hearing. He is the sort of the other side of the coin of like the Maxine Waters of the world, who say equally, or I'd argue, much dumber things, but you won't hear anybody laughing, at least not out loud, while it's happening to Maxine Waters, because she's protected and you'll be destroyed. Your status will be destroyed because while neither of them are worthy, perhaps intellectually, of support, the institutional support is all on the side of Maxine Waters and not at all on the side of Rick Allen. That said, the power structures will gladly take his support and give him nothing in return for it, other than to be able to continue to serve as his district's representative, which he's done for, it looks like, the better part of a decade, 5 terms.
So as you've no doubt heard, there have been massive protests around the United States at college campuses. It started at some of the elite Ivy League schools on the East Coast. The big one was Columbia, and now it's spread to UT in Austin, Texas, UCLA. UCLA actually canceled their commencement address. And so I don't know how much effect the protests will end up having, but what I've found most interesting is just a stark example of how polarized American media has become. Depending on which source you look at, you can see the protests can be described as the worst outbreak of anti-Semitism since World War II. It's another iteration of 1930s Nazi Germany, or it can be described as a glorious protest reminiscent of the 1960s protests that helped in the Vietnam War and led to the passage of the Civil Rights Acts. And so the former perspective was, I believe, best expressed by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He put out a video on X.
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally. But that's not what happened. The response of several university presidents was shameful. Now, fortunately, state, local, federal officials, many of them have responded differently, but there has to be more. More has to be done. It has to be done not only because they attack Israel, that's bad enough. Not only because they want to kill Jews wherever they are, that's bad enough. It's also, when you listen to them, it's also because they say not only death to Israel, death to the Jews, but death to America. And this tells us that there's an anti-Semitic surge here that has terrible consequences. We see this exponential rise of anti-Semitism throughout America and throughout Western societies as Israel tries to defend itself against genocidal terrorists. Genocidal terrorists who hide behind civilians. Yet it is Israel that is falsely accused of genocide. Israel that is falsely accused of starvation and all sundry war crimes. It's all one big libel. But that's not new. We've seen in history that anti-Semitic attacks were always preceded by vilification and slander. Lies that were cast against the Jewish people that are unbelievable, yet people believed them. And what is important now is for all of us who are interested and cherish our values and our civilization, to stand up together and to say enough is enough. We have to stop anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It always precedes larger conflagrations that engulf the entire world. So I ask all of you, Jews and non-Jews alike, who are concerned with our common future and our common values, to do one thing. Stand up, speak up, be counted. Stop anti-Semitism now.
It's worth noting, too, that Germany is perhaps, although not at the same scale, because they don't have the same economic or political or military force behind them, Germany is arguably even more supportive of Israel than the United States is. And of course, there is no evangelical presence in Germany. And the same thing can be said about the United Kingdom. In both of those countries, church attendance is in the single digits, and it has even less influence, far, far less influence on the culture in those countries than it does in America. And the cultural influence in the United States is vanishingly small.
So the reason I played the Netanyahu clip is because, well, first of all, it's the prime minister of Israel, and I think he encapsulates the hysteria that I've seen mostly the right-wing media express over what's happening on these campuses. And if you actually look at the videos, they're pretty innocuous. I've seen quite a few, and that you can tell how desperate they are to make this sound more violent and vitriolic than it is. They seized on this one incident of some person, I think it was at Columbia, supposedly getting stabbed in the eye with a flagpole, and that was played up, of course, and it turns out that was an accident. It was unintentional. So it actually reminded me in some ways of how the media, the left-wing media, portrayed the Trump rallies. They would take, crowds of 20, 30,000 people, and they'd find one person with a stupid sign, a Nazi sign or something, and they would blow that up and say that's representative of the whole. And obviously that's a tactic that's used all the time, but it's interesting to see it used now. And as someone who reveres free speech, it's been disconcerting to see so many of these people, especially on the right, revealed as complete frauds when it comes to free speech. They've spent the better part of a decade complaining about snowflakes on campus and mocking people for claiming that they feel unsafe when anti-black or anti-trans rhetoric, and talking about how outrageous it was that people like Ben Shapiro or Milo Yiannopoulos can't even speak on a college campus, and then they turn around and talk about how Jewish kids feeling unsafe is just so outrageous and we need to send in the National Guard. And this is... So I saw recently Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley sent a letter to Joe Biden saying he needs to do more to stop the protests. He needs to send in the National Guard. I saw this segment on Fox News it was Laura Ingraham interviewing a Jewish student at George Washington University, and Laura Ingraham was just treating him like a poor victim, a pet, petting him and started saying, are you doing okay? Is everything okay? You're so brave for what you're going through. And she, towards the end of the interview, she asked the student, do you feel safe going on campus? And then the student says he admitted that no, he didn't feel physically unsafe, but he did feel, quote, emotionally unsafe. And so I guess it just comes down to the Israel exception to free speech, or maybe the Jewish exception to free speech. And then, of course, you had Mike Johnson traveling to Columbia University and speaking out about how appalled he was at all the rampant anti-Semitism. And so you have the bizarre spectacle of a sizable number of Jewish students in the protest telling a white Gentile that actually, no, we're fine, there isn't anti-Semitism, and then the white Gentile telling the Jewish students that they need to be afraid.
I think it's a pretty naive take to think that the right was serious at all about their opposition to cancel culture or to their support for free speech over the last 10 years, and they couldn't fall over themselves hard enough trying to throw true dissident organizations like American Renaissance or the Groypers under the bus. So it's clearly a grift, and that victimization is the coin of the realm, and so they're going to use it when they can to take advantage of this inner elite power struggle. You contrast this to say something like what happened after the George Floyd's death, and you had the entire institutional apparatus on the same side. So Tom Cotton, he famously made the mistake of talking about calling in the National Guard, and he had people fired on his behalf by simply saying that. So this doesn't even come close to that level in terms of the institutional weight in support of one side or the other. And so that's what I mean when I talk about an inner elite struggle, and that the vast majority of issues that arise and that are putatively fought over in the corporate media are really extremely one-sided, where there is a sort of Goldstein character that's brought out to play the enemy but has no institutional pull at all. In this case, there is some creeping opposition to the Israeli state and Jewish power in the Middle East, and by extension Jewish power in the United States. That, I think that's the junior partner, and I believe that the Israel side of things will come out victorious here, but we do see the dynamic is different than what it is in the cases of other protests. Although I do also want to, I think, correct the assertion that the reaction to these protests is hysterical. I think maybe, again, by comparison to, say, like, what would happen if BLM protesters during the Summer of Love did what they did, and the reaction was much more muted on the right. But if you had, say, white identitarians out there protesting, then you would see what a real hysterical reaction would be. It wouldn't be a couple people sending letters to the executive branch about maybe curtailing some of these issues on campus. It would be, tanks rolling in and people being arrested, if not being openly fired upon, to the general applause of the power structure.
And we see the oppression Olympics coming to the fore again with both sides of this conflict. You'd call it the Jewish Israeli side and the Palestine Gaza side. They are both claiming to be victims in this situation, and accordingly, both a Jewish group and a Palestinian group have both filed separate lawsuits against Columbia University. So I'm going to address the one filed by Palestine Legal. So they filed a lawsuit. It starts with, quote, "We write on behalf of 4 Columbia University students and Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine who have been the target of extreme anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and Islamophobic harassment on campus since October 9, 2023, including receiving multiple death threats, being called terrorists and, quote, Jew killers, being harassed for wearing keffiyehs or hijab, being doxxed, being stereotyped as supporting Hamas or as terrorists, being treated differently by high-ranking administrators, including Columbia University President Manoush Shafiq, being attacked with a chemical agent that led to a Palestinian student and others associated with Palestinians or perceived to be Palestinians being hospitalized, and more. Despite students filing dozens of complaints, Columbia has failed to take meaningful steps to end the harassment, prevent it from occurring, or remedy its effects. Instead, Columbia has reinforced the hostile anti-Palestinian environment, including by suspending Students for Justice in Palestine, a student organization that advocates for Palestinian human rights, for engaging in speech activities supporting Palestinian rights, and by repeatedly engaging in different treatment of Palestinian students and their allies. And so they are suing under the Civil Rights Act. Then on the other side, you've got characters like Shai Davidai, a professor at Columbia whose father is apparently connected to Israeli weapons manufacturing. You have Mr. Davidai calling Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine a terrorist organization and comparing them to the Hitler Youth. So I suppose the coin of the realm here is oppressed. Whoever can convince the power structure that they're the most oppressed has the power.
I think that's actually exactly backwards. It's the people who have the power. They are the ones who are able to portray themselves as victims. The power doesn't come from victimization. Victimization is the manifestation of the power. And that's why I suspect that the Israeli side of this inter-elite dispute will prevail, because the default position that the general public has adopted over time and that the power structure maintains is overwhelmingly pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian. From a YouGov Economist survey this week, we have questions about if Israel is a friend or an ally and if Palestine is a friend or an ally. And so to put it in Schmittian terms, we'll use the friend-enemy distinction. For Israel, the percentage of Americans, all Americans, who say that Israel is a friend is 65% to just 13% that say it's an enemy. The Palestinians, in contrast, just 14% say that it's a friend and 54% say an enemy. And even among Democrats, 61% say that Israel is a friend, just 14% say it's an enemy. And among Palestinians, it's 20% say that Palestine is a friend, 41% say that it's an enemy. So there is some minority position among Democrats to be pro-Palestinian, but even in that case, even among Democrats, it's 2-1 in support for Israel. And at the higher levels of socioeconomic status and influence in the power centers, it's way more lopsided than just 2-1. It's probably closer to 10-1 or 20-1.
So presumably a lot of those elites that you're talking about that are pro-Israel went to elite colleges such as Columbia, Harvard, a lot of these schools where these protests are happening. What do you think will happen when those people graduate and presumably get to those positions of power? Do they have the potential to change the dynamic?
They aren't going to get to those positions of power. Speaking of useful idiots earlier, and in some ways I feel sorry for some of these protesters who are camping out at these campuses, because there's a lot of crossover. I'm not the first to note it. These are the same type of people who were protesting after George Floyd and the BLM riots, and they were celebrated for it. And it was fun, and there were no consequences at all, because they don't realize the power dynamics at play here. But these people are going to be crushed. They're getting doxxed. They're going to have all of the avenues of power shut to them. And so they're in for a real rude awakening, because they thought there were no consequences, career consequences, status consequences, consequences to their futures, because in what they perceived to be fashionable protests in the past, they were only celebrated for it. There was no risk involved at all, but there is risk involved here, and they're going to find out. They're going to be on the business end of that risk calculation. And I think that's what a lot of the condemnation from Congress and from media and from other positions of institutional power, that's what we're seeing playing out now. And in reference to the Jewish student, you heard interviewed about whether or not he felt safe on campus, et cetera, et cetera. I think there is probably a real culture shock to Jews who have enjoyed a real position of privilege in the American status hierarchy. So Pew Research had an in-depth survey asking members of various large religious orientations how they felt about members of other orientations and religious affiliations, and Jews came out the most net positive of any group in the United States. This survey, conducted in 2022, asked about 7 different religious affiliations, and it asked if respondents had a favorable view or indifferent view or an unfavorable view, and taking the net favorability, which is the favorability, and then subtracted from that the unfavorability, Jews came out at a positive 28. Mainline Protestants, so that's the churches that are dying. Those are like the leftists. Those are the flag churches, the rainbow flag churches, plus 20 points. Catholics came out plus 16. Evangelicals came out plus 2. Atheists came out at -4. Muslims came out at -5. And rounding out the bottom were Mormons at -10. And so in a country that is historically Christian, by majority, if not explicitly so, we see that Jews are more favorably viewed than Christians. And attacks on Jews had always been phantoms, or at least they had been up until now. And so the fact that some of these attacks feel a little more real than they ever did in the past, because at least verbally there are some attacks and some criticism, it may be that the seeming hysterical reaction is really just one of somebody being hit in the face for the first time. And instead of just pretending and presuming to be victims, there is some sense, at least an inkling of what real victimization might feel like. And though it's going a little far afield, the survey also asks, it has crosstabs broken down, so it asks each of those groups how they feel about members of other groups. And I've always said for a long time that Ned Flanders from The Simpsons should have been Mormon, because he's the nice guy. He's an upstanding citizen. He is solidly middle class, and he loves everyone, but he has no status. He has negative status, really, and he gets shit on by everyone around him.
Except when the hurricane destroys his house, then he tells everybody how he really feels.
Yeah, I guess casting a modern-day Job as a Mormon might be a little bit tricky. Anyhow, so net favorability. Mormons give evangelical Christians a plus 43. They give mainline Protestants a plus 51. They give Catholics a plus 53. They give Jews a plus 58. They even give Muslims a plus 37. And even atheists, they give a plus 6. Keep in mind, previously, these ratings for Mormons are more favorable than the general population gave to any other group at all, where most of those ratings were positive. In the case of Jews, it was plus 28. Well, Mormons give Jews a plus 58 by comparison, to see just how loving Mormons are to other people. Now, how other groups evaluate Mormons. Protestants give them a -8. Evangelicals give them a -12. Catholics are the only group that put them in positive territory, and it's just barely at plus 2. Jews give them a -13. Atheists give them a -55. And the sample size for Muslims was too small to break down in the crosstabs, but presumably Muslims also give them a negative rating. And so it's clear from this survey data that the real cultural bigotry, if you want to use that term, against any group in modern America is directed against Mormons. But they are really a stand-in for middle America, flyover country. And so I think in a lot of ways, even though their beliefs seem a little bit quirky to a lot of non-Mormon middle Americans, I think they are the best representation of middle America, and that they have such strong support for the structures that are around them and that exist throughout society, and yet those structures all spit on them and have no use for them. And I think in that way that they are a pretty good proxy for middle America. And one last thing before we leave this survey, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention in reference to the evangelical support for Israel that Jews in this survey rated evangelical Christians, put them at a -40. So Jewish disfavorability, low favorability for evangelical Christians is really off the chart. It's higher than they have for any other religious affiliation. They have a plus 19 positive favorability when it comes to atheists, but a -40 when it comes to evangelical Christians. Evangelical Christians, in contrast, have a net plus 39 favorable view towards Jews. So again, to use that for the third time to talk about the phrase useful idiot, evangelicals support Jews, support Israel. Jews, while they take that support, they disdain and despise evangelical Christians in America.
We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Please remember, like, share, subscribe. Talk with you next time.